Hello, welcome to Tennessee Informer. My name is Dave Vance. We have a great informative show for you tonight, and we have a great guest as well. I don't think you'll be disappointed. You know, many, if not most people in America are not only ignorant of this country's history, but of our Constitution as well, not to mention the rights that it protects. They're also ignorant of the limits it intentionally placed on the federal government as a whole, as well as the few powers it delegated to the federal government and the many that were retained by the states and the people. While all abuses and usurpations of power are extremely problematic, our long out of control judicial branch and the reverence that so many seem to hold for it has been one of the most damaging. Likewise, so-called conventional wisdom about what the Supreme Court has actually said often leads to erroneous statements as if they were fact. That is especially true when we're talking about the so-called Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. But are most of the cases that are heard by the Supreme Court or federal courts even federal issues in accordance with the Constitution as written? What about the 14th Amendment? Does that amendment justify federal oversight of restrictions in the Bill of Rights intended to be limits on the federal government only? Could we all not get along better as a country if we actually followed the Constitution and allowed states to deal with their domestic issues? And if the states ensured that the federal government only exercised their delegated powers? So what are the actual legitimate powers and responsibilities of the federal government? What are the powers that were retained by the states? Our guest tonight is a former prosecutor, a defense attorney, and constitutional scholar. He's the president of the Greenville Lawyers Chapter of the Federalist Society in Greenville, South Carolina. He's also a fellow at the Independent Institute and the author of books on the Constitution, his most recent being The Independent Guide to the Constitution, Original Intentions, Modern Inventions. His name is William Watkins Jr., and we're glad to have him with us tonight. Now, that book and some other sources is what we'll be closely looking at tonight. We'll be focusing mostly on the First Amendment, trying to determine if you understand the way the founders intended it. But first, it's time for the Informer Report. All right, I've got an update on the ranchers' beef with Trump. Potential good news that Trump has a plan to allow ranchers to push back on the beef imports when, let me back this up just a little bit. There was a serious issue caused by Trump's plan to let all these imports in. The ranchers pushed back on it because they're already having trouble just staying in business, and allowing more imports in was not going to help the situation. Now, to kind of relieve some of this pressure, Trump has proposed allowing them to process their own beef as a way around the monopoly. There's the monopoly being the four main processors in America. You've got Cargill, Tyson Foods, JBS USA, and National Beef Packing Company. They control about 85% of the country's meat processing. So there's no details yet. Don't even know that if he can actually do it. You know, he tends to exceed his authority on a regular basis. So this is, you know, but before we get to if whether he can do that or not, there's another monopoly worth mentioning in this whole situation, and that is the USDA and their requirement that all meat processing in the U.S. be inspected by the USDA. Now, we all want healthy stuff. We all want safe stuff. But could states not do that? And the imported beef, while we do inspect it when it gets to the ports, we don't have USDA inspections in other countries from what I understand. Now, most of them have a similar program, but we're trusting what they're doing, and you know, we're just looking for obvious things wrong when it gets to our ports. Why couldn't we allow our states to do that? We can trust other countries. We can't trust our states. That doesn't make sense to me. So hopefully his plan will work out. Hopefully we'll get some relief. And, you know, it's dangerous, in my opinion, for us not to have enough beef. The level of beef production, the level of cattle that we have in this country right now is the lowest it's been in decades. And, of course, we have a lot more people now than we had decades ago. So we'll see how that turns out. Back in December of 2025, the Pentagon failed its 8th straight audit as reported in the Military Times. There's a link for that on our Facebook page. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the department remains committed to annual financial audits and is actively conducting a comprehensive review of its budget. The Pentagon reported $4.65 trillion in assets and $4.7 trillion in liabilities, located across 50 states and more than 40 countries. The Secretary is asking for $1.5 trillion for the upcoming FY. No doubt some of this is to replace shortages and losses due to the Iran war. While the administration is legitimately concerned about Iran getting a nuke, there are two bigger threats to our country currently occupying American soil: illegal aliens and Muslims, the latter having declared their intent to overthrow our Constitution. Maybe instead of spending another $1.5 trillion on overseas wars, we should focus on increasing the number of illegal aliens deported and should take concrete steps to crack down and/or jail and deport any Islamic entity providing funding or support for Hamas, CARE, or any other Islamic organization currently in America. We should exclude them from the military and the government as well. We are being invaded by people who stated their intentions. We should act accordingly. Dolly Parton was a very talented, but not, in my opinion, deserving. She was a very talented singer, songwriter, entertainer, great personality. She did do some good things, very generous with her money and her time. But I do not think we should be lowering our flag for an entertainer, any entertainer, or any athlete. You know, we seem to put entertainers and athletes on a pedestal, and I don't think that's a good idea. Lowering our flag is supposed to be, for instance, presidents, ex-presidents, ex-members of the Congress and the Senate. Now, granted, many of those people are not worth lowering a flag for either, don't get me wrong. It also includes certain military officers and certain other officials. Even though many of those people themselves are not worthy of having the flag lowered, that's the protocol. And I think we cheapen it when we lower it for celebrities. I think we cheapen it when we lower it for athletes. I am totally against doing that. Our idolization of entertainers and athletes, in my opinion, is disgraceful. This past week was the 5th anniversary, August 25th, of the Abbey Gate bombing in Afghanistan. They deserve to be remembered and have the flag lowered for them. Another thing to consider, you know, and this ties to veterans, Vietnam veterans especially. Her longtime friendship with Hanoi Jane, traitor fill-in-the-blank Fonda, could be seen by some Vietnam vets as a slap in the face. And while she inherited some traditional Tennessee values, her support for the LGBTQ freaks is not a traditional value. The folks at GLAAD consider her an icon as well for her role as an ally. How Dolly supported the LGBT community, her support for LGBTQ people, it spans decades, and this is from the 90s with her, the track she released, Family, where she expressed that all should be welcome regardless of religion or sexual orientation, to a ballad called Traveling Through, which Parton penned for the film Trans-America. It earned her an Oscar nomination, and her early support, she also showed early support for so-called marriage equality in 2009, well before its legalization. So yes, she had great points as an entertainer. You know, she was a great entertainer. I just don't think she's a role model worthy of lowering flags. Certainly not in my opinion. If you have a story to share or want to reach out to us, you can email us at tninformer.tv@gmail.com. And now a quick word from our sponsor. Check it out and we'll be right back.
Light, the energy of life itself. Since the beginning of time, light has sustained us, fueled our growth, and shaped the world. Even Einstein recognized that everything we are is made of light. But what if we could harness the light within us, not just to live, but to renew, restore, and rejuvenate? Introducing LifeWave X39, the first product in the world that activates stem cells using our body's own light. Backed by clinical research, multiple patents, and over 10 years of stem cell research, a revolutionary wearable light technology that unlocks the power of activating our own stem cells with a single, safe, affordable, non-transdermal patch that puts you back in control of how you look, feel, and perform. Unlike drugs or chemicals, X39 works naturally, awakening your body's ability to heal and thrive. It's time to unlock your full potential, restore your vitality, and embrace a healthier, more vibrant you.
Welcome back, and now to our special guest, William Watkins Jr. Bill, how are you tonight, and thank you for being with us.
No, Dave, it's good to see you again. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's always good to have you on. Let's get right to it, and we're going to talk a little bit about your book, which is excellent, by the way. We had you on not long after it came out. What kind of feedback are you getting on it?
We've gotten some good reviews, and we're getting ready for a second printing already, so it seems like there was some appetite for a book on the Constitution.
Yeah, and it's great because it lays out the original intent, what the original understanding of it was, and then how it got distorted and how to remedy that. And so it's a really good format. I think anybody who's homeschools, or if you know somebody that homeschools, great book. It would really be good if we could get this book in our public schools. That would be excellent. So I'm glad that you've gotten good feedback and you've already got a second printing of it. So tonight we're going to focus mostly on the First Amendment, especially the two clauses concerning religion. I think, but first, to kind of set the right tone, we need to clarify the intent of this amendment as written. Well, really the whole Bill of Rights. So, that's another good thing you have in this book. You've got, when you get to the amendments, you've got a note on the Bill of Rights. And obviously, I'm not looking for a verbatim response, but you want to talk about that a little bit, about how all of the rights came about, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments?
Sure, absolutely. Well, one of the big issues with the Constitution and the anti-federalist mindset was that there was no Bill of Rights, and that every people ought to have guarantees of certain rights against any government. And the anti-federalists made a lot of hay with this because the federalist position is we don't need a Bill of Rights. For example, tailoring this to the First Amendment, James Wilson, in his famous State House Yard speech, argues, why would we need to have any protection for speech when there's no enumerated power in the Constitution that would allow Congress to regulate, say, literary publications? Wilson further raised the specter as if we had such a preacher in the Bill of Rights, that might actually imply that there was some power with Congress to regulate speech or other matters. Therefore, the Federalists argued the Bill of Rights wasn't necessary, and therefore it could be dangerous. Anti-Federalists really didn't buy that. They wanted a Bill of Rights. Madison, of course, was against a Bill of Rights, as most of the Federalists. However, he had a very hotly contested election for the first Congress back in Virginia, and essentially he had to adopt the position that if you elect me, I promise that once I get to Congress, we will consider amendments to the Constitution. Madison narrowly beats James Monroe, who was the anti-federalist candidate in the district he was running for. And, Madison, for the most part, makes pretty good on his promise. He does introduce proposed amendments into the first Congress there, and he recognizes that a number of states and individuals were concerned about the powers granted to the new government, and therefore we are going to introduce these amendments to hopefully quiet these concerns and address some of these concerns. So that's just a little background to the Bill of Rights.
And some of us at least learned it in school. I don't know what they're teaching these days, but I didn't know this until recent years that the Bill of Rights had a preamble, and we've got that on slide we'll put up here in just a second. But that's important because it lays out what it was for. It makes it clear that this was the reason. It was a restriction on the federal government, not on the state government, because the states had their constitution, their Bill of Rights in their constitutions, and they weren't worried about their states. They were worried about the federal government. If we could go ahead and put up there we go. And I'm just going to read it real quick. The conventions of a number of the states having at the time of their adopting the Constitution expressed a desire in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure, and I can't,
The beneficent ends of its
beneficence of
institution.
that institution. Okay. And so made it clear this is why we're doing it. Restriction on the federal government. And that was for the first 10 amendments. And another thing, too, what we call the 10th Amendment, which most people recognize that is that in the ninth is having to do with state powers. Anything not delegated to the federal government is retained by the states or the people. That was one of the main concerns of every state. And that's not our topic today, but I just think that's interesting that all of them had some version. They wanted some version of the 10th Amendment, what we know as the 10th Amendment. That was one of the main concerns of all the states.
That's right. The 10th Amendment was really modeled on the second article of the Articles of Confederation, which limited the Confederation Congress to only those powers expressly granted, often called the Burke Amendment from Thomas Burke, who proposed it and had it adopted. It really establishes and state sovereignty as a bedrock of American constitutionalism. So our 10th Amendment is modeled on that. And you're correct. The states, as they're demanding amendments, that was one of the most important ones for them, is to make clear that the federal government could only exercise the powers that were given to it, that were expressed as for Congress in Article 1, Section 8 there, and it could go no further than those powers, because there was great concern the necessary and proper clause,
Yep.
perhaps improper use of the preamble or the general welfare language in the beginning of Article 1, Section 8, that this would just swallow up the rest of the powers. And of course, the Federalists argue, no, that's not the case.
Yeah.
These are strictly enumerated powers, but the other side had good reason for concern.
Yeah, and I'm glad they did. The supremacy clause, general welfare, you name it. And it's funny because all of the clauses that they worried about, even with the Bill of Rights, are what the big government types today rely on to push their agenda, to push more federal control, and even with the Bill of Rights. So I'm glad we got the Bill of Rights, even though it often gets abused primarily through the courts. But without that, I hate to think, I don't think we would have had this long as a somewhat free country. We're going to go ahead and pop. Go ahead.
Even with the Bill of Rights, and we got to remember this is a poor man's Bill of Rights compared, if you look at the amendments that the states proposed and believed that Congress would actually consider. Madison is very intentional. Yeah, he did give us a Bill of Rights, but he was explicit that he was not going to consider any amendment that might affect a structural change in the Constitution, i.e., that would limit grants of power already given. Because let's face it, Madison in his sort of nationalist phase did not think that the Constitution went far enough initially.
Yep.
So it was a very conservative group of amendments compared to what many of the states asked for, that would have restricted, federal power over taxation, imposed term limits, would have done a number of major things that we could use today.
Yeah, he was, and people forget, he was initially much more of a nationalist and it's strange that he became one of the ones most known for, the states' rights argument. And it's kind of funny, if I'm sure you've read about his conversations between him and Patrick Henry. And in a nutshell, Henry told him, "You have too much confidence in people." And that's my paraphrase of it. I'm sure you can add to that.
Yeah, it's hard to figure Mr. Madison out. Definitely, I think even a lot of the Anti-Federalists agreed that the Confederation Congress needed some invigoration of power. It needed its own source of revenue to pay the national debt from the war, etc., and a few other changes. Um, they were on board with Madison there, but we've got to remember, Madison is posing a power for the federal government in the Virginia plan to have a veto over all state laws. Now, that was a short lived proposal because most folks realized, yeah, if we submit anything like that to the people, they're going to reject this. And Madison soon got that message. But eventually ends up on sort of the right side of the issues in the 1790s. Perhaps he did have more of a limited view than Hamilton, and didn't do it just for popular reasons, but it was consistent with his thought. Though, again, you end up with the Madison in the 1830s trying to distance himself from nullification and essentially just falsely claiming that, oh, Jefferson and I, we never mentioned the word nullification back in the 1790s until someone produced a draft of the Kentucky Resolution in Jefferson's handwriting. And so, you would like to be charitable and say that he was getting old and just forgot, or I'm more likely to think he was thinking about his legacy, kind of saw the direction where this thing was going and wanted to be remembered as the father of the Constitution rather than a participant in state nullification or interposition.
Right, right. Well, I'm glad for the 1790s and the 1800 Madison. I've read that too. I've read people try to kind of, I guess, justify and say, no, he really wasn't saying that. But it's when you read it, it's the first thing that kind of pops in your mind is, okay, so Carey was not the first flip-flopper.
Yeah, his report of 1800 is what a great constitutional document. Just question whether he adhered to it for the rest of his career, but a great document with a lot of truth there.
Yeah. So we're going to pop up the First Amendment here. So before I read this, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, initially understood as limitations on the federal government, not the state government. And then even in the 1830s, John Marshall, the Supreme Court justice, who was very much a nationalist, very rarely, passed up an opportunity to grab power for the federal government. Even in the 1830s, he said the Bill of Rights were a restriction on the federal government and not on the states. And so the First Amendment starts off with, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedoms of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, we're only going to deal with the first portion of this tonight that deals with religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And of course, they call that first one, the court calls that first one portion they call it the Establishment Clause, and then the Free Exercise Clause. When you read this, and it says Congress, as we just said a minute ago, this applied to the federal government, not the state government. I think most people, when they read that, they would take it as all of these things are off limits to the federal government. And, they're not limits on the state government, they're limits on the federal government, and that's the way it was understood.
Oh, that's right. No one at the time of the adoption of the Bill of Rights understood that this was any kind of limitation on the states. As you pointed out, John Marshall in the early 1830s in Supreme Court decision Barron versus Baltimore, essentially, Mr. Barron, was the victim of some dredging that impaired the use of his wharf in the harbor, and he sought money from the local officials. He tried to bring a federal claim, arguing that this was a unconstitutional taking under the Fifth Amendment, taking of his property. And Marshall dismisses that pretty quickly. He says, "Look, everyone who was alive in the 1790s knows exactly why we have a Bill of Rights. It's because the states were concerned about the exercise of powers by the federal government, that it might exceed that which was granted. No one at the time ever dreamed that it would apply the states. And I'm going to reject Mr. Barron's claim because it clearly doesn't. No controversy. I mean, fairly straightforward decision there. So even without the words specifically referring to Congress, no one in their right mind thought that these amendments applied to the states. As you pointed out, the people weren't worried about the state governments. They had their own state bills of rights, or they had annual elections for state representatives and such, and could control their representatives. Remember, these are smaller districts in the states where your representatives mix with the people, go to church with them, go to the grocery where they go. You can easily remonstrate. You can easily talk and be in touch with these folks. So it wasn't like they were these distant individuals that you were worried about. The federal government, however, was different. You had much larger districts, folks from all across the country that didn't share necessarily common culture or climates, and therefore it was a totally different matter.
Or religion, which is a big part of culture. I mean, at the time of the ratification, a lot of the states had their own state established religion.
Yeah, that's right. You have Massachusetts up until I think it's 1833 that continued to have an establishment there. Now, obviously, culturally more, I'll use the term liberal loosely, but more liberal principles prevailed that counseled against an established church, what have you, and especially as America becomes, in a Christian sense, more diverse. You have, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, what have you, Episcopalians, etc. It becomes more problematic to have an established church in that regard. You have so many dissenting Protestant sects, but there's absolutely no provision prohibition rather, if a state wanted to do so. That was completely their bailiwick. It was their decision as a matter of public policy.
And if you ask, well, how did all that change? If people even knew that was the standard prior, well, the 14th Amendment, of course, that's what they'll tell you. But that didn't really happen until decades after the 14th Amendment. And that wasn't the understanding of the court for decades. So when did it actually change? When did the court take it upon itself? And on what grounds did it take it upon itself to say, we are now going to apply the Establishment Clause, as they call it, against the states, and the free exercise thereof against the states?
Well, the Establishment Clause was incorporated, applied against the states starting in the late 1940s. Now, the first incorporation of provisions of the First Amendment occurred in the 1920s. But again, this is a long way from 1868. From 1868 until the middle of the 1920s, you don't have any incorporation of provisions of the Bill of Rights against the states at all, and it starts with the First Amendment. There's the argument is that John Bingham and others in the Congress at the time desired that fundamental rights, which they believed was shorthand for the Bill of Rights, were to be applied to the states there. And there are some, couple instances in the debates where that argument is made. Again, Jacob Howard, Bingham make that argument. However, that's really not how the 14th Amendment was explained to the folks back home, especially up north. It was explained as essential, hey, this is a modest measure as long as we're not treating black people as second-class citizens like those bad Southerners down there. Nothing's going to change for us. We will continue with our Republican governments in our states. And there's not going to be a big change. Also, I think it helps to remember that the Civil Rights Act of 1866, essentially the 14th Amendment, is drafted to constitutionalize that.
Almost verbatim, if not verbatim. I think it's pretty much verbatim, isn't it?
It's no scholar would argue that that wasn't a key purpose of the 14th Amendment. And there's nothing about religion in the Civil Rights Act. It essentially wants to ensure that the newly freed slaves rightly can make contracts, they can inherit property, they can go to the courts for redress, etc. Just basic rights that you need to live as an independent citizen in society. And that was the limits of the 14th Amendment, as Raoul Berger in his book, Government by Judiciary, as well as a shorter book just dealing with the 14th Amendment, makes a great case for this interpretation. And I think probably to me, the strongest points are, again, you don't have incorporation until years and years later. You don't have, say, the northern states changing their constitutions to make them congruent with the Bill of Rights, i.e., for grand jury presentment in all criminal cases and other rights of criminal procedure that we find in the Fifth Amendment, etc., that were not universally observed throughout the Union. States had their own criminal practice and procedure on how they did things. And there was no, I guess, we've adopted the 14th Amendment. We need to scrub our constitutions up here in the North and fix these things. No, because no one understood that the Bill of Rights was now applicable to the states. Early Supreme Court precedent rejects this. And of course, the Supreme Court, there's, case Twitchell, I believe from 1868 or 69, that rejects an application of the Bill of Rights to the states. And, they're sitting there in Washington. Everybody's aware of the great debates in Congress. If, they would have understood that this was the clear intent, you would expect a decision that's otherwise. But it's not the clear intent. Yep, you can point to some language from Howard, from Bingham, but the totality of the evidence, I think, is strongly against incorporation, that is, application of the Bill of Rights to the states.
You mentioned Twitchell, which was 1868, and then the one that more people are familiar with is the Slaughterhouse case in 1873. And they didn't take it that way. Plus, like you said, if that had been the case, all the states would have had to make more changes to their constitution. And of course, they also they try to equate the Bill of Rights, which remember we said was a limit on the federal government. They try to conflate that with the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Now, and I think Bingham is one of the guys who made the claim at some point, well, and nobody believed this when he said this in this debate in Congress, which he put forth two different bills on this issue. He withdrew his first bill, but at one point in time, he made the remark that the Privileges and Immunity Clause in I think Article 4, I think it's Article 4, I could be wrong, that included the Bill of Rights. Nobody believed that. That doesn't make sense. If you were taking a test right now and you said that the Bill of Rights are covered under the Privileges and Immunity Clause or that they are the same thing, well, I think you'd fail that test because they're not the same thing. And the only thing that makes sense is if the Bill of Rights was a restriction on the federal government, when you adopt the 14th Amendment and you make the freed slave a citizen, then that would then mean he's now a citizen, and the restrictions on the federal government, he's now also protected from the federal government, just like all of the white citizens. Wouldn't that make more sense?
Oh, it would make a whole lot more sense. And, for example, the 14th Amendment has its own due process clause that no state shall deny its citizens due process of law. Well, why would Bingham and Howard have this in the amendment if they're incorporating the Fifth Amendment, which has its own due process provision? That doesn't make any sense. That's drafting foolishness there. Part of the problem is a lot of the radicals, as well as sort of your Lincolnians today, grasp onto a decision by Justice Bushrod Washington, Coriel, in which he argues, and this is all in dicta, it's not necessary to the decision. He looks at the Privileges and Immunities Clause in Article 4. And I mean, essentially, his ultimate decision is, I believe it was New Jersey, that, yeah, sure, New Jersey can prohibit an out-of-stater from plundering its oyster beds and, taking, say, that back to wherever, Maryland, New York, what have you. No problem. But he gives this dicta on, what are privileges and immunities, and in sweeping language, majestic language, talks about natural rights, fundamental rights, even includes the right to vote, which no one would have held. I mean, so if someone crosses the border from North Carolina to South Carolina, they should have the right to vote immediately in my election and then go back to, no, I mean, it was just, it's crazy. But a lot of folks, because of the name Washington, and they like the, again, lofty language, they will appeal to that and say, well, that's the meaning of privileges and immunities, when there's much clearer case law from state courts earlier that essentially state that privileges and immunities are essentially, I wouldn't call them rights, but privileges given by grace from the state governments. For example, to take wild game or what have you, hunting licenses. Under Washington's theory, I guess, that you should be able to come to South Carolina, and if we assume the state has the right to regulate wild game and the taking of it, that you should pay the same thing for your hunting license as me as a citizen, which no state does that.
Right.
Out-of-staters pay more money for their hunting license, their tags, whatever you want to call them, than we in-state folks. So it's that's the understanding of privileges and immunities, not this expansive dicta that Washington laid out.
And wouldn't the immunities also include things like, you can use the courts to, sue. You have the same business privilege if as far as they can't treat you different in terms of punishments. I mean, that was more the due process. I think that was the intent was, okay, you couldn't have, all right, if a black guy does this, he's going to get 10 years, but if a white guy does it, we're just going to give him 2 years. Or a black guy can't have character witnesses, but a white guy can have. I think it was more about just being fair. And really, how is it you could change the Bill of Rights and not name the Bill of Rights in an amendment? I mean, I can't imagine. First off, if that was their intent, and they would have said we're gonna apply the Bill of Rights to the states. Most of the northern states, which, oh, by the way, it did not breeze through in all the northern states anyway, and certainly not in the western states. I don't think they would have ever gotten it through if they had said we are going to apply the Bill of Rights to the states. I don't think they could have gotten it through.
No, I think you make a good argument there that, I mean, a first grader could write a clearer constitutional amendment applying the Bill of Rights to the states than, the lawyers in the Reconstruction Congress, if that was their intent. But I'm with you. I think the evidence is clear that it wasn't.
Right. And so they started in the 20s with the First Amendment. They started, I think there actually was a case on establishment in the 30s, but what everybody remembers is the one from 47. Is that Everson? Is it Everson?
Yeah.
Okay. And so when we hear people talk about, our freedom of religion, and they act like it's a long protected right, and it is to a great degree, but it was not. The Supreme Court has not been the one, and the federal courts have not been the one that we even thought had a say on the issue, because it was pretty clear they weren't supposed to say anything about it. The no establishment clause meant they had nothing to say about it until 1947, when the court, through incorporation, which from everything I can tell is a court-created doctrine. Am I right?
You are right. No, it's what you have, as you point out, is essentially the whole design was to leave the states alone if they wanted to have an established church, or if they wanted, even if not a fully established church, to say collect money to be distributed for the furtherance of Protestant Christianity, which of course, America was a Protestant country. You have small pockets of Catholicism here and there, but most of the founders understood it to be a Protestant Christian country. And the states were to be left alone if they chose to support Protestant Christianity or have an established church. That was their business. And if they wanted to change that was their business as well. There was absolutely no federal role at all for the Congress or any branch of government to interfere.
So this is like a big violation of the Constitution that's now about 80 years old, or pushing 80 years old, and we've just accepted it. Basically, we've basically just allowed the Supreme Court to be an ongoing constitutional convention. I think I heard that from you first, so give you credit. And I think that's an accurate description. It's just an ongoing constitutional convention.
No, I mean, most people, I would say your average citizen has zero idea about the history. What we started talking about tonight about that the Bill of Rights applied to the federal government only, and even your great nationalists like Marshall understood it that way. They would look at you like you have two heads. You make that argument, and then you point out that you have established churches up until the 1830s in some states. That just seems incongruent with them. They're used to, essentially the court, and this isn't necessarily establishment, but free exercise as well. And they do blend together. But, the court essentially constitutionalized a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association, where he uses the magic words, wall of separation between church and state, which, perfectly congruent with Enlightenment values and Jefferson's own personal beliefs. But it's certainly not a majority report from the founding era when you look at the practice of the era, even in the federal government with the First Amendment. There's no one ever question Congress having chaplains, Congress declaring days of prayer and thanksgiving, things like this, which our modern court would look aghast on, but for the long established precedent of these things. Uh, no one thought the First Amendment even stopped Congress from doing that, much less how we see the court has used these provisions to do everything from prohibiting Ten Commandments, to be posted in schoolhouses or in courthouses, or to prohibit nativity scenes unless you throw, Charlie Brown's Christmas tree and some reindeer and an elf or two. It's okay. Where does that come from? It's just made up in a jurist's head.
And most conservatives will tell you they oppose a living constitution. But if you think the court has the right to make up standards, something other than the Constitution, and that they can just willy-nilly incorporate things, and they can just create standards, then you believe in a living Constitution. I mean, that's the way I see it. I mean, if you agree with what the court, and now granted, the court, this particular court has, I do like some of their findings, okay? And I think that some of their findings are more in keeping with the founders' intent, even though I think they're still usurping power and many things they should have nothing to say about, especially when it comes to the Bill of Rights. But so in a living constitution, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, that's people that believe that, okay, the founders wrote the Constitution, and even though they gave us clearly a process to pass amendments to the Constitution, and we've done that, I think, 27 times over the years, that the courts can basically weigh in and adjust based on society, based on what they think is best. So they're going to basically set aside the written Constitution that's supposed to have a definitive meaning and a set meaning, and we're going to modify it, we're going to upgrade it to make it modern and to coincide with modern sensibilities. You think that's an accurate description of a living Constitution?
No, I think that's a great description. I think the easiest example is think about punishments. We know we have a Eighth Amendment that prohibits cruel and unusual punishments, and we know at the time of the founding that it was not uncommon for, say, someone as a punishment to get an ear chopped off, or maybe to have a public whipping or something like that. Uh, do we have that now? No. Why? Well, because of evolving standards, the state legislatures, etc., decided, yeah, maybe we don't need to permanently disfigure folks. We can sentence them to prison or make them pay a fine, what have you. And we went away from that as
A standard.
popular, right, popular opinion standards develop. Whereas today, the court would claim the authority to decide what is cruel and unusual based on evolving standards of decency. My argument is, how do you measure evolving standards? Well, you would look at state criminal codes, and they they set their standards, and that's how you can tell what's evolved. But the court claims that authority now, whereas in the past, again, to get rid of certain punishments like that we might not be so fond of today, it was the people's business. Not anymore. Everything is the court's business. Everything is constitutionalized. It's for a judge to make that decision rather than the people or their representatives.
Yeah, and that's a big part of why we're so divided as a country, because everything is going to come down to generally a 5-4 Supreme Court opinion on things that our founders would have not stood for the federal government having anything to say about. But we've come to accept that, and I think that's a huge problem. I don't think we fix our country, and I don't think we can keep our country together long term if we don't get this right. This is one of those things we have to fix. This idea that judges can just replace the written Constitution with their opinion or even a bad precedent. I mean, the whole Roe v. Wade, the whole gay marriage garbage, all of those things were based on court opinions, not on any fair reading of the Constitution, in my opinion.
No, it's essentially the court deciding to update practice based on what it sees as congruent with liberal ideals, not anything in history, tradition, written word. It's essentially we have Platonic guardians at the Supreme Court deciding what is good, what is evil, and making decisions that way. They're making public policy. They're essentially the final policymakers. And I think to your point, that it's one of the reasons you have this sort of just our politicians are gladiators in an arena trying to kill each other because every decision has to be for a continental entity, the United States. It can't be that you want some sort of government sponsored health care. Well, sure, your state can try that out. We'll watch. If we like what we see, we might do it. Or with drugs, if you want to legalize marijuana, that's fine. You do that. Other states will watch and see how that experiment goes, and they can follow suit or they can keep with the laws they have. But instead, it's winner take all for all 50 states on matters that the founders considered would be local decisions.
And even since 1947, the Establishment Clause, and I think that because they separate the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, I'm not sure when they set their current precedent for the free exercise or initial set. What I'm getting at is, even since that time frame, even since they usurped that power and said this is the standard, they're not still using the same standard today as they were in the 40s and 50s, are they?
No, it's changed. It's like, for example, the Lemon test, which was the establishment test for years, Lemon versus Kurtzman, I believe a case from the late 1960s, which boils down to any state law that has excessive entanglement with religion or is seen promoting religion is a no-go. And that was the standard until about 2022 when the Roberts Court holds, that's not historical. That doesn't add up with the founding period, and they finally rejected the Lemon test. So, it's just an evolving, patchwork of guessing, really.
Yeah, and you mentioned basically the reference back to at the time of the founding, time of the Bill of Rights, and I think I think that's a good thing. But to my point, if the court is still giving opinions about things that were not legitimately under federal authority, they're still violating. They're still usurping the Constitution, in my opinion.
No, they absolutely are. Even like, for example, even things I think you and I probably just as policy matters as individuals, like the Second Amendment.
Yep.
I think more people ought to have firearms. We would be safer if teachers in schools were carrying, and folks in their churches were carrying. I'm all for that, but I also realize that the nationalization of the Second Amendment, the incorporation, is, as we're arguing tonight, is contrary to the original intent of framers of the Constitution that only applied to the federal government. So if Gavin Newsom and the California legislature wanted to ban handguns and California, if that's consistent with their constitution, they could do that. I hate that for gun owners in California, but I also recognize we live in a federal union, and that's their problem. And they can address that by beating feet to another state that perhaps has more liberal gun laws. So again, even though love the Second Amendment, love my firearms. I could reach over here and show you my 1911 sitting by my desk. I do understand that even with Heller and McDonald, the court is overreached there, even though I like
You like the
those
result.
policy results.
We like the result. We like the result of Bruin and these others, but if we're honest about it, they're overreach. And here's the flip side of that. If we lose the midterms, the Democrats are already talking about packing the court. And if they pack the court, then unfortunately we may have, Thomas may decide, hey, you know what, I've had enough. Maybe even Alito decides, hey, I've had enough. And the next thing you know, we've got even more liberals. So now, since we've deferred that power to the court, and since we said that was okay, it's going to go the other way. That's why it's so much better at the state. Now, we have enough problems at our state level. I'm in Tennessee, and, we're supposed to have constitutional carry, and we're supposed to, our state constitution says we have a right to keep and bear arms, although the legislature is allowed to regulate the wearing of arms with a view to reduce crime. But even our state Supreme Court has said our intent to go armed law is unconstitutional according to our state constitution. So here we are in Tennessee. We've got Bruin, and of course, generally, anytime the court hints at anything, everybody says, okay, this is what we have to do. They fought us on that. They're violating our state constitution. But I would still rather just have it at the state level. I'd still just rather fight at the state level than have to worry about, 10 years from now, Supreme Court changes, and, oh, guess what? You can, we're going to restrict your right now. And so
That's right.
That's the problem, in my opinion.
No, our system's designed for us to figure these things out on our state and local level, to have, good, wholesome interfamily squabbles to sort these things out. It is not designed to have a uniform rule on these local matters for an entire continent. There, Madison and other Federalists tell us that essentially the national government, foreign affairs, commerce, diplomacy, war, that's it.
Yep.
That's where their power extends to. But we've made everything from whether a homeless guy can pitch a tent on a public street. That's a national matter for the Supreme Court to decide these days. I mean, we're living in, we're through the looking glass, my friend.
Yeah. Now, in terms of free exercise of religion, now, besides obvious examples of violence, the Supreme Court has found that religion is not a pass for criminal behavior, right? I mean, you can't just do anything and say, well, that's my religion. They've established that. Matter of fact, I think their standards are even a little stricter, because I think it actually says it can't violate, infringe on the peace or public safety, and that may not be the exact term, but it doesn't necessarily, in terms of free exercise thereof, it's not, okay, you can do anything unless it's violent. You can't just violate laws and say, well, that's my religion. Can you hit on that a little bit?
No, that's right. The Supreme Court did have a precedent back in the 90s. Scalia wrote the opinion essentially that so long as it's a law of general applicability, you're not targeting religion, you can criminalize certain behavior there. For example, if your religion requires that you do cocaine, if we assume that the federal government or state or whatever can have drug laws and prohibit that, as long as they're not targeting, that religion. Nope, sorry, you can't be snorting cocaine during your service. However, that was tightening up on a standard, and then Congress has the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. which states typically and governments have to show a compelling interest before they can interfere with religion. But still, public safety, as you pointed out, could be a compelling interest there, so long as the law is narrowly tailored. So no, it's not a free for all.
And it's not just public safety. It says peace or public safety. And the reason I bring that up is Reynolds' case in 1879 had to do with a Mormon who violated a federal regulation by being married to more than one woman. And he took it to the court and said, hey, this is, at this time, the understanding was the Bill of Rights was just a restriction on the federal government. So it didn't really bring in the question of the Bill of Rights, but the court said that because he was claiming it was a violation of his free exercise. And the court said at the time that no, the federal government does have a right to regulate in terms, and it wasn't a matter of public safety, but more to do with peace slash it had to kind of mesh with our religious culture. Our traditional culture was against multiple marriages, and I'm sure I'm kind of just murdering this, but our country was founded on traditional Christian values, and this would have been a violation of that. So that this was in fact not but it was not that the federal government could regulate, and this was like say in 1879, that law was not a violation because it was so out of line with our national character, our national culture, that it would be, I guess you say, against the peace and standards of the country. And
yeah, no, I mean, if you look at early commentators like Justice Story and his commentary on the Constitution, though, Story was a nationalist, and there's a lot I don't like. I mean, he makes the clear point that he viewed the United States as essentially a Christian culture and would not have a problem legally with states advancing Christianity. He would have been aghast, I think, that, for example, we have Dearborn, Michigan, and other places where you have essentially an alien religion, an alien culture advancing there. I think Story would have had no problem with states limiting, some of this Islamic practice and culture as incongruent with a Republican society founded on Protestant Christianity. That wouldn't be a popular view today, but that's how Story saw the matter then, and he was right there in the thick of it.
And so I'm glad you brought up Islam, because that was really kind of where I was headed with this. A lot of things in Sharia are already a crime. I mean, you can't kill in the religion in Islam, if somebody leaves it, you can kill them. Okay, that's already a crime. That's not something they can cover. It's already a crime to kill a non-Muslim. It's already a crime to do a lot of the things that are in Sharia law. Now, there's zakat, as they call it, their tithing. Part of that is supposed to be designated for jihad, because they are also required to take part in jihad. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to go blow somebody up, but they have to support the jihad, and they have to do some of that with their zakat. So is that not a fair target for us to look at the zakat? Is that not something that courts could look at and say, hey, well, this is their doctrine. They're going to use part of this zakat to fund terrorism. Do we not have a right to look at that? Do we not have a right to say, matter of fact, I think Tennessee already has a law, material support. So my understanding of the Tennessee law already, that if they whatever the source, if they're providing funding for terrorism, that's already against the law, right?
Short answer, I think that the state legislatures, have a police power. They can regulate, they can pass laws for the health, welfare, safety, morals of the people, and to the extent some of these practices you describe are counter to that. Um, that would be an area of state regulation. Now, of course, the Supreme Court probably sees that things much differently than that. But that's, again, going back to story and the traditional understanding. That would be how that generation. Well, first of all, I can't believe they couldn't imagine that we would have allowed an invasion as we have to
Yeah.
begin with.
Yeah.
But secondly, that would be a matter for the states to regulate with their police powers, and that would be, again, under the traditional understanding of the Bill of Rights that we talked about, Barron versus Baltimore. There'd be no that wouldn't be the federal government's business, but they make it their business these days.
Yeah. So if we were doing this right, states could take their own tact on this, and whatever their state constitution. Now that could be a downside. Michigan might go totally Muslim. I don't know. But if you left it up to if states had the ability, they didn't have to worry about, Supreme Court, because everybody thinks, well, we can't touch it because it's a religion. But that's not even the current understanding of the court. We can't tell them you can't believe in this, and we can't tell them you can't say this, but there's a whole lot we can do with behavior. The court in the past has made it pretty clear, we don't touch on beliefs, but we have a lot to say about behavior. But once again, this should be allowed to happen at the state level, because if we leave it up to the federal level, if we continue under this, okay, we got to defer it all to the federal court and the Supreme Court, I don't think we win this. I think we'll lose this if we continue to defer to the federal courts especially on this issue, but on all other issues as well.
I can't disagree with you. I mean, it's sort of like you mentioned the homosexual marriage case where the court decided that couple of millennia of human practice, essentially, and human understanding of the relationship between the sexes and marriage was unconstitutional. Uh, you know, uh, would be playing with the same fire. And the religion context, you're absolutely right, Dave.
Well, and I've really talked more than I wanted to, probably because I couldn't get it out effectively, and I apologize for that. But I want to hear some of your other thoughts on this in reference to the Establishment Clause, freedom of religion, or anything else under the Bill of Rights that you think that people need to think about. And then, what do we do? How do we fix this?
No, I mean, I would just sort of kind of close out by telling folks that you've got to realize that the problem is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution were meant to be essentially a shield for the states and the people. With incorporation, it's turned it into a sword that can be used by the federal government to restrict what the states and the people can do. What used to be normal public policy choices and decisions that they could make are now limited. The federal government has more power in this area, and that certainly wasn't the intent of the Bill of Rights, and frankly, wasn't the intent of the Reconstruction Congress. They wanted to constitutionalize the Civil Rights Act, as we talked about, but they didn't go down this far down the road. So I think it's important for us to come to grips with that history.
Yeah. And that takes states standing up. First off, they have to admit that. They have to admit that they've allowed themselves to be dictated to by the federal government, especially over the last 100 years. I mean, it goes beyond that, but let's say 1925, because that's when they started the incorporation. That's not necessarily when they started the overreach, but when you're talking about the Bill of Rights, that's when that whole incorporation process started. And even with that, they didn't do it all at once. You would think if they discovered in 1925 that, hey, yeah, this was all about the Bill of Rights, then you would think that, boom, automatically, obviously you couldn't do that with the Ninth and 10th, but that automatically everything would have been codified. But that's not the way it was. It was over really 2010. So it went from 1925 to 2010 with the Heller opinion. So,
Or even further than Heller, before Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, she incorporated the excessive fines provision of the Eighth Amendment. What was that, like 2018 or so, against the states there. So it even goes further. No, Hugo Black made that argument on the Supreme Court that instead of this selective incorporation, it ought to be an all or nothing. If it's incorporated, it's incorporated. If it's not, the court shouldn't pick and choose which provisions. Now, unfortunately, Hugo Black thought the whole thing was incorporated.
yeah,
I disagree with him there, but uh, at least his motive was to stop judicial cherry picking of rights they thought more important and to apply those and to limit judicial power in that way. But yeah, you're right. The whole history of it has been a selective approach that certainly isn't borne out by anything in the Reconstruction debates or the history of the time.
yeah. And I've read some. I know there was pushback through the years as these things happened, and of course we don't really hear about that anymore. I mean, I doubt everybody just took the Everson decision in '47 with, oh, okay, now we know how that's supposed to work. I'm sure there was pushback, but we don't hear those arguments anymore. I mean, it's just, okay, yeah, that's the way it is, and we just go on. And I'm sure they had some great arguments even at the time.
No, that's right. And, I mean, essentially today, I think the problem is that we're so far uh, from describing when we talk about our country, the United States are, we say the United States is. And we don't understand that we live in a federal union. We think we're just like any European unitary state. The people don't understand the structure of their government, what it was intended. And then, of course, you have the liberals wielding that if you want to push back on federal power, then who are you? Well, you're George Wallace. You're
Yeah,
Strom Thurmond. You're, a segregationist. You're a bad guy.
yeah,
Rather, and we could always push back. Well, what about those nullifiers in the 1850s who were nullifying the fugitive slave clause? Are you think they're bad guys because they were interposing? No, it's just it's that we've let the left sort of tar and feather state interposition, state sovereignty with you know those unfortunate aspects of the past when that is truly a small story of state interposition, state sovereignty. It's a vibrant story that is not a Southern story. It's an American story that has been hidden from the people.
well, the revolution started off with nullification before the shots started. And really, you think about it, even after we fired shots, it was a year before we declared independence. So a lot of the actions that the founders were taking leading up to 1776 were attempts to nullify the the king and the parliament at the time, their actions. That was all attempts. So to me, nullification is very American. And then some of the first nullification was tried by the New England states. The southern states got to it late, but most people don't even realize that, hey, the first group to try nullification was New England.
No, they don't realize that, as you mentioned, for example, Jefferson and his Summary View of the Rights of British America,
Yep.
published in 1774, declares several acts of Parliament void and of no force because Parliament's a foreign jurisdiction.
Yep.
Jefferson didn't come up with nullification in 1798 and the Kentucky Resolution. This is pure American Revolution 101 that, again, we've sort of forgotten.
Yeah. Any other concerns or closing thoughts?
No, I thank you for having a forum where we can talk about these issues. And most people are divorced from this aspect of their history. And Dave, just thank you for making a forum where we can discuss things and give folks some food for thought.
Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on. It's great to have somebody of your caliber on this show. And hey, this book, I'm telling you, you need to get this book. You need to read it. You need to have it as a resource. If you're a homeschooler, you definitely need it. And if you could, hey, I mean, I guess if somebody had the backbone and the determination, they could get it in their public school, although I don't know if schools actually use books anymore. I think it's all perverted stuff online from everything I can tell. And you can get this on Amazon, or you can get it at the Independent Institute, correct?
Absolutely, Amazon, or you can go to independent.org to their bookstore, and you'll have this book as well as my book on the Anti-Federalists, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, all there.
Yeah, and you've got quite a few good articles on the Independent Institute as well as Law and Liberty, if I remember correct.
Yep, I do some for Law and Liberty, well as a little bit for the Abbeville Institute.
Yeah, you know what? I watched you. Actually, it was last night, and you were talking about, this was a fairly recent one, but it didn't give the date. It must have been before the 4th, because you were talking about the Declaration of Independence.
Yep, I did a program with the summer school for the students on that.
Yeah, that was very good as well. Any upcoming events?
I'll be going actually to New York to talk about the Anti-Federalists on November 10th, New York City. As part of a program there. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, be careful up there. That's definitely enemy territory.
It is, but we'll have fun.
All right. Well, hey, thanks again. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for all you do.
Thank you, Dave.
I want to take the time to thank the audience for tuning into our program tonight. We appreciate your support. You can check out our audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter so you never miss an episode at our website, teeninformer.com. You can find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. A couple announcements here. Saturday, September 12th, the TFA, Tennessee Farm Association, will hold its annual fundraiser at the Farm Bureau building at the Wilson County Fairgrounds in Lebanon, Tennessee. The MC will be Dr. Ken Berry, or as the producer says, the incomparable Dr. Ken Berry. And the keynote speaker will be award-winning journalist Laura Logan. Registration begins around 9 a.m. They're going to have vendor tables and social time. Wits Barbecue will provide the on-site lunch. Speakers and announcements begin at noon. There will also be a silent auction that will run during the event, and a live auction follows the speaker program. For tickets, go to the website, tfalac.org/events at the 2026 annual event. What do you know about jury nullification? What do you need to know about it? An online course is starting this September 10th, 7 p.m. Central via Zoom. Danny Blitz, the White County lead for the Tennessee Citizens for State Sovereignty. She's the lead for this event. Learn more and register, or go to, and I cannot see, there's a link on there. You can go to the site, or you can go to patriotmama.org. That's patriotmama.org. If you subscribe to our newsletter, these events will be listed in there as well. Just know what you will learn is something most judges do not want you to know, and may even tell you is wrong. They might tell you this because they believe that minimizes their own power or neglects the law, which is also wrong. The judge has his or her job. The jurors have theirs to do to vote their conscience. We also covered the topic of jury nullification, or attempted to, a couple of months ago with our guest Jeff Cobble, and hopefully we will be able to get him back on here to actually talk in depth about that. Join us next week for a discussion on 9/11. 25 years and things are only worse. Please take the time to check out our other shows brought to you by West Tennessee TV by going to myparistv.com. There you can find links to the Mike Weatherford Show and Sportscast with Jeremy Buckalow. Tomorrow, Mike welcomes the amazing couple from here in Tennessee. Their food truck exploded and almost killed them. Despite all the heat and flames, Tim McPherson went back in to rescue his wife from certain death. All this on the day before their 25th anniversary. They were both severely burned and are recovering. They'll be sharing their harrowing experience with Mike tomorrow, 7 p.m. Please be sure to tune in for that. Also, if you missed last Thursday's Mike's show, I think it was called After Dark, he had a good show on there with our local SEC leader here, Tess Robbins, had the state chairman, Scott Golden, and Representative Jay Reedy. It's worth listening to. And next Sunday, 7:30 p.m., Jeremy returns with another episode of Sportscast Live. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.